anaerobic and aerobic. So storage is mainly in the liver and in the muscles. You can see glucose is stored in the form of glycogen, so that when glucose is required, it is broken down by the process of glycogenolysis, and this is the process of catabolism. Glycogenesis is really now the opposite, and this is what insulin does, as we spoke about last week. Insulin is important in anabolism, so it's going to combine and put together different glucose molecules to form glycogen. Glucagon is glycogenolytic, and it will be involved in catabolism. We also talked about the other glucose counter-regulatory molecules such as cortisol, adrenaline, and other products that are important in breaking it down. So when we come to the cytoplasm, we have anaerobic metabolism. You can see the glucose molecule loses a phosphate bond to be able to form ATP from ADP. And this then will lead to the formation of pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid then will enter the mitochondrium and will need oxygen to be able to convert it to acetyl-CoA, and that will release carbon dioxide. And once carbon dioxide is released, the acetyl-CoA continues in the citric acid cycle and producing more carbon dioxide during the cycle. Then we also have electrons that are produced during the citric acid cycle, and this now will enter the electron transport system that we talked about, so that one molecule of glucose will produce up to 36 ATPs. So let us look at macronutrients. And remember, we said macronutrients are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So in the carbohydrate metabolism, we have the mitochondrial part of the pathway, which is the citric acid cycle and the electron transport system. And this is normally aerobic, and it requires, meaning that it requires oxygen. Each glucose molecule will produce up to 36 ATP molecules. And this is why we find that carbohydrates are primarily catabolized for energy. ATP, you find that the molecules in which the energy is obtained from breakdown of foods is important, and it serves as a direct source of energy for the functions of the cell. Carbohydrate metabolism is also important in the storage of glucose. Usually when the body does not require is not able to metabolize the glucose, the body will want to store the glucose so that it can be used when it is required at a later time. So when glucose is not needed immediately for making ATP, it is normally stored as glycogen, which is a long chain of glucose subunits, both in the liver and in the muscle cells. This is the process of glycogenesis. And remember, we said insulin is an important hormone in ensuring we have glycogenesis. So it's an anaerobic process of joining glucose molecules together in a chain to form glucose, to be able to store glucose, to be able to provide glucose for later use. Then we have glycogenolysis, which is the catabolic process of breaking down glycogen chains, releasing the individual glucose molecules for use of making ATP when this is required. And this will take place during the fasting period. So during the fed state, we have glycogenesis taking part where we are storing, and during glycogenolysis, you're breaking it down. So ATP basically is an important source of energy. You can see one ATP has adenosine, which is an amino acid that is bound to 3 high energy phosphate groups that are bound together. And most of this energy we get from milk, from bread, and from all the other products. And it's normally important in ensuring that we have a source of energy. So when we have a breakdown of the high energy bonds, which is ATP, when it loses a phosphate bond, then it becomes ADP, and it goes back to be able to pick another phosphate bond from the energy producing carbohydrates. And this is important for the cellular processes. Blood glucose is also very important in carbohydrate metabolism, and usually we also call it blood sugar. The normal levels are between 80 to 100 milligrams per ml during fasting. Insulin will usually now facilitate the movement of glucose out of the blood into the cells, and therefore it will decrease the blood glucose and increase glucose catabolism. So we know glucose is converted to glucose 6-phosphate when insulin activates the glucose transporters in the peripheral tissues. And here we are basically looking at it being used in the peripheral tissues, in the adipose tissue, muscle, and also in the liver. Fat metabolism is also important because this is where fat has more energy source, about 9 kilocalories, as opposed to glucose that has 4 kilocalories. And so basically we have catabolism taking place to yield energy, and is normally anabolized to form adipose tissue. Protein metabolism is also important, and during starvation, we usually see a lot of protein catabolism taking place. But during the feeding state, then a lot of protein metabolism, anabolism takes place because the body really cannot store protein. It's used for building the body tissues. So what cannot be stored is normally released through the urine or broken down within the liver and removed as waste. So these are the different types of nutrients, and I think we've discussed this, carbon dioxide being the main products. Micronutrients basically are organic molecules that are needed in small amounts for normal metabolism, and these are basically vitamins and minerals. The difference between vitamins and minerals is that minerals are inorganic molecules, vitamins are organic molecules. Uh, Minerals are usually found naturally in the earth and are required in small amounts by the body for normal functions. This is a table showing the major vitamins that are required in the body. And as you can see, we have several diet sources that are indicated and several different functions. And you can see the consequences of deficiency when we don't have these vitamins. Vitamin A, for example, has a very good source of energy from green and yellow vegetables, dairy products, and in the liver. It's important in maintaining the epithelial tissues, functions of the epithelial tissues, and producing the visual pigments. When you don't have vitamin A, one will experience night blindness, dry eyes, possibly leading to blindness, and also flaking of the skin. Then we have the vitamin B complex vitamins, as you can see, which will mainly come from grains, meat, and vegetables, and uh, uh, dairy products. And one example is vitamin B1, which is thiamine, and it normally helps enzymes in the citric acid cycle that we've talked about in metabolism. A lack of thiamine then will lead to nerve problems such as beriberi, heart muscle weakness, edema, which is usually associated with vitamin B1 deficiency, especially in alcoholism. Then B2, which is riboflavin, comes from the green vegetables, the organ meats, the eggs, and the dairy products. It helps enzymes also in the citric acid cycle. So you can see we have several enzymes that are vitamins that are important in the citric acid cycle, including niacin. So riboflavin is important in ensuring this process takes place, and its deficiency will lead to inflammation of the skin and mucous membrane, and also so the patient will have irritation around the mouth and the eyes. Niacin we get niacin from meat and grains, and it also is important in the citric acid cycle. Lack of niacin will lead to pellagra, which is a scaly dermatitis and also causes mental disturbance. And we have nervous disorders and diarrhea. Vitamin B5, which is pantothenic acid, comes from meat, eggs, and liver. It helps the enzymes that connect fat and carbohydrate catabolism. And basically, it's important in ensuring that the body has good coordination, so that lack of pantothenic acid, although it is rare, leads to loss of coordination. Pyridoxine B6 comes from vegetables, meats, and grains. It helps enzymes that catabolize amino acids, and lack of it leads to convulsions, irritability, and anemia. Cyanocobalamin, which is vitamin B12, will come from meat, dairy products, and it's involved in blood formation and other processes. We normally know that absorption is important because of the intrinsic factor that's normally in the gut, and I think you shall do this when you look at digestion. And the lack of that will lead to pernicious anemia. Biotin is also important, found in vegetables, meat, and in eggs. It helps with enzymes in the amino acid catabolism, both and also fat and glycogen synthesis. Lack of biotin, although it is rare, will lead to muscle and mental problems. Folic acid which is what we get from vegetables, help enzymes in amino acid catabolism and blood production. You know, you need both B12 here and folate to be able to make blood. So usually for patients with anemia, you want to encourage them to take a lot of cyanocobalamin and folic acid so that they can be able to make more blood and improve their hemoglobin. So usually it's always good to have an option of allowing the diet to correct the hemoglobin in this case before you consider a transfusion, unless it is required for the management of the patient, or the patient has very low blood hemoglobin and that is leading to heart failure. So the lack of folic acid will lead to digestive disorders, which include anemia, prenatal neurotube defects, and this is actually very common, especially around the 16th week of pregnancy. Vitamin C is important. It's also called ascorbic acid, found in fruits and green vegetables. It's very important in maintaining collagen, manufacturing collagen, so that the lack of it then leads to scurvy and degeneration of the skin and bone and blood vessels. Vitamin D, we talked about it, is calciferol, found in dairy products and fish oil, fish liver oil. It helps in calcium absorption, and the lack of it will lead to rickets and skeletal deformity. Vitamin E, which is tocopherol, comes also from green vegetables and seeds. It protects the cell membrane from being catabolized, and it's important in muscle and reproductive disorders. And its deficiency is actually quite rare. Then you have vitamin K, K1, and K2, which is usually will come from the intestinal bacteria in the synthetic form of K3, and it helps in blood clotting and bone metabolism. And when it's lacking, then we have blood clotting disorders and bone loss. Then these are the minerals that we've talked about, and we said vitamins are organic micronutrients, minerals are inorganic micronutrients, and both of them are required in less than 100 milligrams uh, per day as a recommended daily allowance. Calcium is important. It comes from dairy products, and we've talked about it, legumes and vegetables. It helps in blood clotting, bone formation, nerves, muscle functions, and its deficiency leads to bone degradation, nerve, remember we talked about tetany, and muscle malfunction. Chlorine comes from salty foods. It helps in stomach acid production, an acid base balance. Its deficiency, of course, leads to acid base imbalance. Cobalt, we get cobalt from meat. It helps vitamin B12 synthesis in the blood cell production, and its lack will lead to pernicious anemia. Copper is very common in seafood, organ meats, and also in legumes. It's important in extracting energy from the citric acid cycle and in blood production. The lack of copper will lead to fatigue and anemia. Iodine, it comes from seafood and iodized salt. It's important in thyroid hormone synthesis, and its lack will lead to goiter, thyroid enlargement, and a decrease in metabolic rate. We shall talk about thyroid gland in our next lecture, and we shall discuss more about the role of thyroxine and the need for iodine and how that leads to goiter. Iron is important in source, and it comes from meat, eggs, vegetables, and legumes. It's involved in extracting energy from the citric cycle, acid cycle, and it's important in red blood cell formation. So you see, we have a common function between iron and copper in both of these micronutrients, and you can see we have similar symptoms of deficiency such as fatigue and anemia. Magnesium will come from vegetables and grains. It helps in the activation of many enzymes, and the lack of it will lead to nerve disorders, blood vessel dilatation, and heart rhythm problems. Commonly, we know that whenever someone presents with convulsions, especially children, you also want to measure the amount of magnesium they have, because that could also be a cause of the convulsion. Manganese will come from vegetables, legumes, and grains. It also helps in activating many enzymes, and its deficiency will lead to muscle and nerve disorders. Phosphorus is a dairy product and comes from dairy products and meat. It helps in bone formation, and we discussed it when we talked about calcium. It is now the source of phosphate for making ATP, DNA, RNA, and phospholipids, and its deficiency will lead to bone generation and metabolic problems. Phosphate, potassium will come from seafood, milk, fruits, and meats. It's important in maintaining the functions of muscles and nerves, and the lack of it will lead to muscle weakness, heart problems, and nerve problems. So whenever we have potassium derangements, then we basically have those problems. Sodium is important, and it comes from salty foods. It helps in muscle and nerve function and fluid balance, and the lack of sodium will lead to weakness and digestive upset. Zinc will also come from many foods. It helps in many enzymes, and it's important in metabolic functions and diarrhea. So how does the body regulate food intake? Usually the hypothalamus is a very important center in regulating food intake. We have the appetite center and the satiety center. The appetite center will promote the feeling of hunger, and the satiety center will promote the feeling that we are satisfied or we are full. Our body's regulation of food intake is complex with many factors, including hormones, neurotransmitters, emotions, environmental cues, food sensations, and habits. So basically, we have quite a number of factors that will regulate food intake. We have two forms of metabolic rate that are usually measured. One is the total metabolic rate, and the other one is the basal metabolic rate. The basal metabolic rate measures the rate of metabolism when a person is resting, but they are awake and they are not digesting food and they are comfortably warm. On the other side, on the other hand, is that you have the total metabolic amount of energy which is used in the body per day. So this is the figure looking at differences between the basal metabolic rate and the total metabolic rate. And you can see the basal metabolic rate is really uh, depends on the size of the individual, the surface area. So we have children having a higher metabolic rate than adults because of their size. Gender, we have men having a more higher metabolic rate than women. Body composition, which is the ratio of lean to fat ratio. Age, the amount of thyroxine hormone, and other factors such as fever, drugs, and emotions. All those will contribute to the basal metabolic rate. Exercise and all the other kind of muscular activities will also contribute. Remember, we said the total metabolic rate is the total amount of energy used by the body in a day. So exercise and all the kinds of muscular activity will contribute to the total metabolic rate. The food intake, the thermic energy effect of food, the Thermodynamic energy coming from food will also contribute to the total metabolic rate. And then we also have environmental factors, environmental temperature, also contributing to the total metabolic rate. So again, you can see the differences between the factors that contribute to the basal metabolic rate, which is size, sex, bone composition, age, thyroid hormone, and other miscellaneous products, while we have exercise, food intake, and the environment contributing to the total metabolic rate. This is the basal metabolic rate formula, which is by Milfin-Senjour equation. And you're looking at basal metabolic rate, which is in kilocalories per day. So you multiply the weight by a factor of 10, the multiply height by the factor of 6.25, multiply age by a factor of 5, and then you'll actually see the difference between sex. So S will be the factor you put in depending on whether the individual is male or female. So if the individual is male, you add 5. If the individual is female, you subtract 161. So this is a formula that is used to calculate basal metabolic rate. So thank you very much, and I would like to invite questions. Any questions? So for the height, is it? So the formula is by mil row. So this is the formula. So basically, we're saying if you're going to calculate the basal metabolic rate, you have to have the weight, the height, and also the gender of the person, the sex of the person. So the weight will be in kilograms, you multiply by 10. The height you multiply in centimeters, you multiply by 6.25, and the age you multiply by you also have age. Age you multiply by 5. For the sex, so if the person is male, you're going to add 5. So it will be plus 5. If the person is female, it will be minus 161. And that is really the difference. So based on metabolic rate would basically give you an idea of how much energy the person has in terms of how much energy that the person is producing when they are not eating. It gives you the function of the amount of energy the body has. And it's important, especially in conditions where we have a reduced metabolism, because then the patient will have a lot of fatigue. And that is the significance. So let's look at another lecture on protein, on basic nutrition aspects of metabolism. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand the pathophysiology of malnutrition and also the mechanism of obesity. So we have primary cases and secondary causes of malnutrition. It's a short lecture. So the primary causes are due to inadequate feeding, and secondary causes are due to repeated infections, genetic causes such as syndromes, chronic diseases such as chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, celiac disease, diabetes mellitus, and other metabolic disorders. So when you think about malnutrition, think about the lack of feeding being as a primary source, and then even after feeding, you may have secondary causes that are due to what is happening in the body. Malnutrition will result from an imbalance between intake and protein energy requirements, which results in tissue losses with adverse functional consequences. Generally, find that metabolic rate, when a child has marasmus, then they are available to meet the body's requirements. So generally, the body will tend to store, have own consumption and increase protein intake, and this leads to decreased synthesis of visceral proteins. Again, it's important for you to distinguish between kwashiorkor and marasmus. In marasmus, we have insufficient energy intake, while in kwashiorkor, we have insufficient protein intake. In the pathophysiology of malnutrition, we have reduced adaptation and also a smaller size and thinness and smaller organs and reduced immunity. So basically, this is a result of lack of nutrition. The physiologic effects of nutrition are cut across different systems from the heart, the gut, the genitourinary system, the immune system, the liver, endocrine, cellular functions. Actually, it's all the systems. In the heart, we have a reduced cardiac output and stroke volume, and reduced blood pressure and reduced renal perfusion. The main concern here is that any increase in blood volume can actually produce acute heart. For example, patients with kwashiorkor with the issue of increase in blood actually tissue. In the gut, there is less gastric acid being produced. The intestine does not move as fast as it should, so have reduced motility and increased rate of. And this is why some allergies food for production of enzymes, pancreatic atrophy, and you also have decreased secretion of digestive enzymes that are secondary to small intestine mucosal atrophy. So you find the villi almost completely gone, and that also will reduce absorption of nutrients as the patient is trying to recover. Also have nutrients when large amounts of food are ingested, again because of these other factors. Reduced motility, reduced acidity, reduced enzymes, that ultimately will affect the absorption of nutrients. In the genitourinary system, we basically have reduced glomerular filtration, reduced ability for renal excretion of acid or water load. Then you have reduced sodium excretion, reduced urine phosphate output, and there's also an increased incidence of urinary tract infection because we'll have a lot of stasis, and the bladder will now the E. coli in the bladder and the other bacteria will start increasing in number. The concern here is that a large protein load may not be well tolerated by the kidney. Again, you give small amounts of proteins to be able to spare the kidneys. So further protein deprivation will lead to continued tissue breakdown. In the immune system, we have a reduction in the cell-mediated immunity, IgA secretion, and also complement components, and also the efficacy of phagocytes. So here the concern is that the typical signs of infection, such as a raised blood cell count or fever, are usually absent. So most of the time you find in malnutrition, even if you take the full blood count, you may not get a problem because of the lack of the immune dysregulation. Hypoglycemia and hypothermia are usually signs of severe infection. So you find for patients who have marasmus and kwashiorkor, you want to keep them warm and give them glucose. So basically, we need to treat all our patients with broad spectrum antibiotics to be able to protect them against infection. So what happens in the liver? Because of lack of nutrients, then you have a reduction in all synthesis of all the proteins, and also a reduction in gluconeogenesis. The main concern here is the risk of hypoglycemia being high, and particularly with infection. In the endocrine system, you find that we have a reduction in insulin levels, and this leads to glucose intolerance. We have a reduction in insulin growth factor, and also an increase in growth hormone, and increase in cortisol. And you remember we said growth hormone and cortisol are the glucose counterregulatory factors. Or we've had this lecture before. Okay, if we've had the lecture before, then it's okay. We can stop there. So are there any questions? If there are no questions, I'll share the notes. Thank you. Have a good day.